and Eben and I are welcoming you all back this week. We're going to do a little bit of tag teaming today, so I'm going to kick things off. Today represents dialogue session number 83 for the Coronavirus Multi-Species Reading Group. So yay, and thank you so much to our visitors today. We're really thrilled to listen and learn from Drs. Teresa Montoya of the University of Chicago and cancer epidemiologist Marc Emerson of North Carolina, Chapel Hill's Center for American Indian Health. And they're going to be talking to us about their recent publication titled Confronting Legacies of Structural Racism and Settler Colonialism to Understand COVID-19 Impacts on the Navajo Nation. And Teresa, you and I met some years back at the UCLA Chemical Entanglement Symposium that was hosted by the working group there within the Center for Study of Women. So it's really wonderful to get to see you again and to be reading your latest co-authored work and to hear more from you and Marc about these new directions in your research and in your thinking. So, but I'm wondering if before we dive into this piece, if you could just give us some context for Diné people and Navajo Nation. Tell us maybe a little bit about the land base. You write historically and contemporarily in this piece that you shared with us. You talk about the long walk and the concentration camps. And I'm just wondering if you can give us a context for the land base historically and then and today.
Yeah, well, Marc and I actually have like a little PowerPoint here, so I'll go ahead and bring that up. I'll give a little bit of historical context. Marc can jump in at any time with more of like the epi perspectives. Yeah, because I write from a social science anthropological perspective. And I just want to say that this collaboration has been really fruitful and enjoyable. Marc and I had known about each other for a really long time through our social networks. His late father was a mentor to me, Larry Emerson, who inspired this table that we put about relational knowledge and approaches to research. So we'll talk about that later. But yeah, I just wanted to say, thank you to Marc for helping guide me in trying to understand some of these public health perspectives. So I will share. Okay, can you see it now? Okay, so just to give you, I guess, a broader sense of the historical legacy of environmental contamination on the Navajo Nation. Oh no, it's going into its, I'll leave it in this mode. Yeah, this is just a picture of a water tank. So there's over 500 abandoned uranium mines on the Navajo Nation. So I think it's important to point to the legacy of these environmental contaminants and just the fact that this is a downwinder region. So from nuclear testing in both Nevada and New Mexico during the Cold War era, the Colorado Plateau on which the Navajo Nation is located. So this entire region is known as the Colorado Plateau, is really rich in uranium and vanadium resources, in addition to coal and now natural gas and the Eastern Agency of the Navajo Nation. So all of these materials have been extensively extracted from Diné-Bikea, or what we refer to as the Navajo homelands. So this map here is just showing the concentration of various abandoned uranium mines in the Navajo Nation. The EPA is currently in its second 5-year plan with the Navajo Nation to help clean up some of these sites, but of course, most of them have not even been addressed. So as a result, there's several, contaminated wells, contaminating our aquifers. Only 40% of approximately of Navajo households have don't have running water. So these wells, actually, a lot of folks draw upon these not only to help water their livestock, but some actually use it for household use. So this tank here, several grassroots groups, artfully decorate these wells across the Navajo Nation. And this one just says that this well has been found to have exceedances of uranium contamination. This is just an image of a DOE site in Shiprock, New Mexico. This is a community actually near where Marc is from. In the background, you can see the iconic Shiprock rock feature. And in the foreground, there's a sign that's warning people about these contaminants. This site is overlooking the San Juan River. It's hard to see here in this map, but the river approximately follows this area here. This was really hit hard from the 2015 Gold King mine spill, which you may recall these like images of putrid yellow water. That area also has all of these uranium sites, and this is a former milling site for uranium. So even if the mines aren't located there, these mill sites also have, skewed contamination. This is just, an image to show, the lasting impacts not only on our lands from these environmental contaminants, but also within our bodies. So this just shows various forms of radioactive contamination and where it bioaccumulates in the body. And lastly, just to give another geographic perspective, what I like about this map, not only does it show the bodies of water, but it shows our 4 sacred mountains. So this original treaty reservation, as you read in the piece, was established following a period of incarceration known as Wilde. So Navajos were forcibly interned at this camp in this part of New Mexico. And the Navajos who were able to return to their homelands, right here is the original treaty reservation. So it's vastly smaller than what encompasses our homelands, and our homelands encompasses all of this area within the 4 sacred mountains. So even the geopolitical boundaries currently is not how we actually imagine our homelands. Like, we don't have any reservation land in Colorado, even though 2 of our sacred mountains are located in Colorado. So I always just like to point that out, as folks, I think, have a short memory in terms of settler boundaries. And of course, all of these are a relatively recent configuration spatially. I'm going to let Marc, I don't know if Marc wants to add anything to what I'm saying here.
No, Teresa, you're doing a great job. But just quickly, I think thinking about kind of the relational aspect, and just also wanted to extend my gratitude for being here. I'm really thankful for being invited and sharing this space with you all this morning, or morning here in North Carolina anyway. And speaking of North Carolina, I just want to quickly say that recognize that this land in North Carolina and the sovereignty of the natives here. So this is unceded territory for the Saponi and the Eno and the Tulani peoples and the Ikonichi. And so this area that I'm in right now is in Durham, North Carolina. And so there's Duke University here, and there's UNC Chapel Hill. And so these areas are unceded territories for people that have been living here for generations, as we know, and have formed their kinship network systems that were finally displaced by the colonization of North Carolina. And so, yeah, thinking about these kinships, also, thinking about how I want to introduce myself and being relational, and thinking about greeting those who've come before me, and like Teresa said, thinking about my late father, and thinking about you all and the colleagues here and friends present with this morning. So my name is Marc Emerson, and so Navajo, we introduce ourselves by our clans. And so my mother's clan, so I'm half Navajo and half Jemez, which is a Pueblo tribe in New Mexico. And so in Navajo, it's Ma'i, and so it's Ma'i de Shkijni, which is the Navajo word for Coyote Pass, or this Coyote side is my mom's side, and so that's my mom, and then my maternal grandparents, and then my father's clan is the Sleep Rock people, and then my paternal grandparents' clan is the Benihogans clan. So just wanted to introduce myself in a good way, and again, just say I'm thankful. And yeah, I think what Teresa was saying about like this, the only thing I was thinking about was in that previous slide, Teresa, and thinking about all these things. I don't know, I was thinking of a way how this ties in with all these health effects of our Navajo women, and thinking about that generation, I think, of women who were pregnant during this time. I think these are kind of another way that health effects can manifest contemporarily, that have these legacies that are pinned to these things too. So I think there's just like making clear that connection as well, and seeing these specific, as you can see here, these specific health issues that I think have come up, and those are not these acute things that happen overnight, right? And so due to settler colonialism, we've seen these things show up in more of this long-term chronic disease way, and that have affected, I think, a whole generation in thinking about reproductive health and kind of the ill outcomes that have been manifested out of that. So I just think making that like connection just real explicit in terms of what that looks like, and thinking about kind of synthesizing these things together. So.
Okay, Mark. Okay, I'll jump forward to this slide now. So our collaboration actually started probably just about a year ago. I remember it was over Christmas break. I did not go home for the holidays because that was during one of those surges. So I stayed in Chicago, which was rather depressing, but I used that, as most academics do, to just kind of dig into some reading. So I got really interested in the Spanish flu. I mean, I wasn't the only one who was kind of making these broader connections between, you know, this epidemic from a century ago, but I was really curious to know about the particular impacts of the Spanish flu on the Navajo Nation. So I did find a number of resources. Unsurprisingly, these were written by Indian agents and anthropologists. So when I approached Marc, you know, he was thinking about some of the interpretations of the current epi data. So even though this piece was really short, you know, we had severe limitations in word count. We wanted just to bring together, you know, this historical reflection of the Spanish, is a misnomer, but the flu of so-called Spanish flu, and then COVID-19. And really broadly, you know, a lot of these accounts attributed the high rate of Navajo mortality to cultural practices. In addition to, you know, lack of access to medical facilities. And so that second portion, you know, I think not much has changed probably over the past century. Now we have IHS and Navajo managed medical facilities. Nevertheless, we don't have many specialists, you know, so drawing upon my own experience of caring for my late grandfather, you know, there's no cardiologists on, you know, at the local hospitals. So you have people would have to drive hours just to, you know, visit a cardiologist, endocrinologist, you know, so this severely, you know, impacts the availability of these services for Diné people. But I think what we also wanted to highlight in this piece was not so much these formal networks of healthcare, but rather this, you know, what we're calling relational care. So networks of ke, which is what we refer to as our kinship system, but this is also an ethical obligation to take care of one another, not just our families, but you know, animal, non-human kin. And so these types of signs, many folks would create and post all over the Navajo Nation. So when I did go home in January, here's an image. Someone had just you know, put near the roadside, and these are just all over the Navajo Nation. And this is quite different from the other spaces that I've encountered in border towns or back in Chicago. But there was a real like grassroots, community oriented like public health campaign. Here's like a more culturally appropriate sign for social distancing. So mini Diné still raise sheep. So and just a reminder to stay 2 sheep apart. So I love this sign. And also here, I mean, so like this in terms of like culturally appropriate public health intervention. So Dikos Nitsagi Natseada, it literally means big cough. 19. So this was like one of like the early interventions. There's still a large population of our elders that speak Navajo. And so a lot of the public health campaigns have also been over radio. But then I think this is also reflective of a younger generation. I think you recall this meme that went viral last year, Bernie Sanders, when he was wearing the gloves. Let's see. And this was just an image here showing, I was vaccinated actually in February of last year with my grandparents, and we were waiting at the hospital, and it took about like 3 hours waiting in line. So people were very eager to get the vaccine early on. Because Navajo Nation was severely hit early on in the pandemic, it was a hot spot at one point. It was the most concentrated COVID spot. The Navajo Nation was able to obtain vaccines much earlier compared to the rest of the nation. Like everyone who got vaccinated got these stickers. So yeah, I just wanted to give a kind of a quick overview to provide some context for COVID public health interventions on the Navajo Nation. Okay. So now I'm back here.
I'll open the floor too if anyone wants to jump in with their questions, or if you want to pop them in the chat, please do. If not, I'm sure we've got Amina. Yeah, go ahead.
Sure. Thank you, both of you, for that introduction and that contextualization. Again, my name is Amina. I just maybe a technical question to start out. I'm really grateful the way you translated the flu of the 1918 pandemic was different just now than what was written in the article. I think you just described it, Teresa, as the big cough. Am I right? Is that so? This is prior to germ theory of disease being predominant. And so I'm hearing you speak about the way that disease is spoken of in a much more physiological way. It's not the germ or the coronavirus, it's the symptom, the physiology, the ecological naming of disease instead of an ontological, it's a creature, it's more of the effects, upon kin. And here we are now speaking about a disease, and we do it in these far more ontological, external ways where the disease is actually this critter, right? And I'm wondering about the way that is inflected in Diné culture, and how it relates to, we talk about the ontology of this ethic of more relational care, and I'm wondering how that relates to the way you speak about disease itself. I mean, how is disease named and spoken of and conceived? Is it more relational? Could you speak to that a little bit for me?
Yeah, thank you. Okay, so the Dikos Netsagi, that's the translation for corona or COVID-19.
Okay.
Currently.
Okay.
And so the translation that was given in the article was about the Spanish flu, which I cannot pronounce that correctly, and I will not attempt to, because I had to draw upon a colleague who could translate that for me. There's been actually different ways that the Spanish flu has been discussed. which of course there's no like official, or especially at this time, like Navajo orthography, or, you know, I think a lot of dialect is regional. So even like my grandparents who are from different sides of the reservation had different ways of pronouncing things. So the translation that I learned was translated as during the time the flu killed. So this is also referring to, you know, a historical period when a lot of people died. And the more symptomatic description that you're referring to with Dikosnitsagi, yeah, I mean, Navajo is a very descriptive language. I don't speak it fluently. This is just a consequence of colonization and boarding school era. My grandma went to boarding school. My grandfather did not. He spoke Navajo more fluently than she did. But both of them, you know, didn't make a strong effort to teach my mom or my aunt Navajo, who grew up, you know, in the 1950s era. My grandparents lived in the capital of the Navajo Nation, Window Rock. Both worked for the BIA, so that, you know, this assimilation effort, you know, I think really shows within that boomer generation. Whereas now in my generation, Marc's generation, I think we're, you know, trying to relearn and draw upon these cultural frameworks and language. So I think that's kind of part of our effort here in drawing upon which is this framework of relational care.
So I didn't realize I had it backwards, that actually it's in this.
Oh, no worries.
Still that that COVID is spoken of in this more relational way, which is really fascinating, encouraging, and we just love to hear more about what happens as research is trying to happen in epistemologies and ontologies right now that name disease in these more ontological ways, and then here, you know, in this Navajo way of speaking, it is still much more ecological and more physiological, and I think much more fluent with the way that I think a lot of multi-species conversations want to think about the reality of what is the phenomenon of disease. Yeah, this is great.
I don't know if Marc wanted to speak on this. What the phrase for cancer in Diné-centered, which is the sword that does not heal. I don't know if you wanted to speak to that more. That's your specialty.
Yeah, thanks, Teresa. Yeah, so I think that's another interesting example, Amina, that might also, like, I guess it's thinking, maybe taking a step back and also, you know, sharing a little bit of my background too, and how that relates to language use and the importance of that is also parents kind of that boarding school era. And so, you know, my parents went to boarding school, and, you know, that was just steeped, I think, for my father later on in life, and also, you know, other difficulties, I think, that really led to kind of this overall like shame, I think. And I think that was like, in some ways, consciously like kind of stopped, and then other ways like unconsciously kind of passed down. I think language use was an example of that. And so, you know, overall, as I understand it, I'm not a fluent speaker myself, but there's less of, like Teresa was saying, of this subject-object split in the language. And so I think it's also another example of how maybe when we talk about things being nonlinear, like even in the language use, I think that shows up in how we kind of divide the day into four kind of quadrants, if you will, or four time periods, and the language use around that, and how we think about language use conversationally, and then also ceremonially, and how we think about language use in the stories we tell and the language we use at different times of the season too, in our storytelling and oral traditions. And so I mentioned that because I think some of that, how I always think of it is like when you kind of stack these things up, that you know, more traditional or whatever language use with a lot of, you know, I don't know, modern like medical talk or jargon, like some of the things kind of fall through the cracks. And so, you know, kind of being critically minded about that shows up. And I think that's a good example, Teresa, is how we even think about defining new things. And so diseases, I guess. And so one of those in kind of in the work I do is thinking even how we talk about cancer, and how we translate that. And Teresa's right. I think one issue with that is one way that we do speak about it is in the way that's literally translated as the wound that never heals or the sore that doesn't go away. And so that has interesting, or not interesting, it has kind of these harmful ramifications, I think, in terms of how the mindset is in terms of seeking treatment, or in terms of that fear that comes with a possible diagnosis, and just in thinking about yeah, I guess like Teresa was saying, that's another good example of language use, like to your point, that's more descriptive of symptomology, but in this case, that may not be, accurate, I guess, or can be harmful in terms of thinking about how, so this is some of the work that we're doing also back home is on the Navajo Nation is thinking about overall, and this is the last kind of thing I'll say about it, is just overall like questioning, okay, these are things that we know about how we think about research, and this is how research has been done historically, that is basically like not by us, right? It's been always like white dudes that are doing all the like research. And so how do we think about sovereignty? How do we think about decolonization in kind of in the space of public health, in the space of research? Like, how do we own that? And part of that has to do with language. A lot of that has to do with revitalization of how we think about these things more traditionally. And like, what is that, blend? It's not necessarily like this either or kind of language. It's like, how do we be inclusive of these different spaces, And so that's kind of like this broader thing that relates to, I guess, the point I was making about cancer, and thinking about, therefore, like thinking about treatments, and thinking about how we I guess like think about screening, and how we kind of think about these different like issues that come historically, again, going back to a lot of things we talked about in this paper of how we got to where we are now. And a lot of that has led to these issues, like Teresa was saying, like with her grandfather, like seeking specialist care, that's just these very inequitable, a lot of barriers just in terms of the actual distance to care. And like, just, I was thinking about that when Teresa said it, and it brings up a lot of things that when my father was going through his cancer experience, a lot of his surgeries and kind of consultations that came with that were in Albuquerque, Mexico, which is a 3.5-hour drive from the farm. And during that time, he had his stomach cancer. And so he was going through a lot of pain, I think, like towards the end in his treatments. And so I just remember like, he was just like, please just like try not to hit like these bumps in the road. And like, that was just like that's just like a very fine detail in it, because if you've driven through the Navajo Nation, there's just like, the roads are not in good condition. A lot of them aren't paved. And so it's just really difficult, even just thinking about giving him a comfortable ride in that like distance of 200 or whatever, like 3.5-hour drive. But so, yeah, anyway, I think, a lot of it has to do with like trying to hold space and thinking about how we work through these processes, and really trying to hold the like more traditional space as kind of this template, to really kind of think about how do we deliver healthcare and specialty care like cancer care or cardiology, and for more specific heart disease, which, as we know, like historically and contemporarily, these things, and overall point is a lot of this how we got here is this legacy of settler colonial violence, that we have these inequitable health issues of hypertension, of diabetes, like all these things we hear about our own people, and that kind of always being this deficit-based framework that we kind of have to always hear about ourselves, high rates of heart disease, high rates of cancer, et cetera. And so I think a lot of that is thinking like through this relational care, how do we frame that out, and how do we talk about it in this way? And when I'm back home in the community, a lot of it's just like, man, we're so tired of hearing like we have high rates of the worst things, or like low rates of the good things. We're tired of hearing how poor we are, blah blah blah. And so it's thinking about like, how do we talk about these in a way that I think is meaningful for us in doing this work in a relational way.
Thank you. Oh, I just want to make one quick comment responding to Mark. So I think it's like the National Cancer Institute. So there's been all these discussions about the redefinitions of cancer. I mean, this is not COVID, but this, because that's more established as a field. Yeah, so the original terminology, the sword does not heal, I think did have a very negative connotation. And within Navajo epistemology, traditionally, for instance, folks don't talk about death. So there's, aversion and taboo around death, visiting grave sites. There's certain ceremonies, for soldiers returning from war or having any sort of contact with death. And that's the association that it could bring death upon you or illness. So because of that, the notion of a sword does not heal, like forecloses a possibility for healing. So in that way, language is very powerful, right? So, and also, in Navajo belief, your thoughts, you begin the day, as Mark was talking about, this cyclical notion, the quadrants of the day, that's also referenced in a life cycle. So thoughts in their formation in your mind also have potency, right, for future outcome. So if you have these negative thoughts, it can also affect your physical health. So part of the discussion about reframing that term was specifically, I think, for elders that had this more traditional mindset about negative, like having any sort of negative thoughts. So the new, and I can't pronounce it correctly, but I think the new terminology was something about how cells in the body that grow uncontrollably. So how do you even talk about cells or these minute things within the body in the Navajo epistemology? But those kind of reframings, I think, are very intentional because you don't want anything so negative that would have foreclosed the possibility of a healing sort of framework. Because there are cancer treatments and you can heal from it. So yeah, I just wanted to kind of like bring that up in terms of thinking about the power of language. And I noticed Evan had a question, so yeah.
So thank you to both of you for being here and for sharing this important article. One of the things I'm picking up on is, just sort of these distributed hostile infrastructures and architectures that are pervading the landscape here, whether it was the road that Marc told us about that was bumpy, and the distributed infrastructure of healthcare, but also the image you offered us, Teresa, of the the fence and the water behind the fence and, unsafe for humans, and trying to think about, the distributed infrastructures of militarism and war and these ephemeral chemical and radioactive exposures. I was also thinking about just issues of visibility and invisibility, not only as it relates to infrastructures, but also as it related to the COVID-19 or big cough outbreak. And that was one of the surprising things I took from your essay. I mean, we all, New York, New Jersey became this hyper visible space in the pandemic imaginary of mass death. And I mean, until I read this now, a year and a half, almost 2 years later, I had no idea that the Navajo Nation, eclipsed, these urban centers as a space of, suffering and death early in the pandemic. And I was wondering if you could just comment about, invisibility and hypervisibility in the colonial mediascape, and, how is it that, we have all sorts of projects on the color of COVID, but still, the Diné people seem to be invisible on the national scale.
Yeah, thanks. I'll say briefly before I let Marc explain from an epi perspective. And definitely in terms of, well, one, like demographic data that's available, I think is complicated by jurisdictional boundaries. So the Navajo Nation extends across 3 states currently, Arizona, New Mexico, Utah. So I think the accessibility of data has been complicated by by these boundaries, and how do you register COVID cases or deaths across multiple state boundaries. The Navajo Nation, it does have a COVID-19 board, so I think by now they've kind of perfected this, but this has had to fall on the burden of the Navajo Nation, like epidemiologists, to interpret that data, right? This isn't something that state jurisdictions are doing freely on their own to account for specific Navajo or American Indian populations. Losing my train of thought. Oh, in terms of legibility, I'll just give another corollary example. So in some of my research, when I was focusing on downstream effects of the Church Rock spill of 1979, when there was a consideration of the Superfund sites, these are based on population density. So, I mean, I think this also, is reflected in contemporary mediascape of which sorts of stories, become publicized or not. Like urban centers like New York, of course, are publicized, even though there was a higher concentration of Navajos who had COVID cases, because it's just not a large population, and because it's spread across this rural area, it wasn't registering the same way. So, I mean, I think this could also be applied to just rural areas in general, but even more so because of the racialized dynamics and settler colonial history of the Navajo Nation. So yeah, I think time and time again, whether it's like environmental regulation or now we're seeing with public health, the low population density of the Navajo Nation has served to kind of obscure the high impacts of this disease.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think I like the points that Teresa made are spot on. I think those things are really especially I think like when it comes to a response to something that was like critical, like COVID, I think that kind of particularly comes out. And so I feel like, this has always been a thing. And I think even the intention that we had collaborating on this paper was some visibility to a degree, right, Teresa, like thinking about how we can elevate our community and thinking about these important things that we're thinking through. And I just think that's a critical question because, kind of also the context of the time we wrote this, it was, before the vaccines were a thing, I guess. So I think like hopefully like the next thing that Teresa and I collaborate on, I think it'll be thinking about kind of moving into that space. Because at the time, as you can tell, kind of the overall like structure of this essay was really navigating through that space. And I think a lot of that underlying context was thinking about this issue. And so I think that'll also be important kind of, this next steps of thinking about what that visibility and visibility looks like, especially with these major issues that happened and kind of the context around that, but then also, the response to it too, which was important as well. And I think that also deserves or like needs space to be told, I guess, as well. And so, yeah, and I think that all kind of just speaks to a lot of the barriers and underlying, what current surveillance systems or what current medical systems are like, I guess, on the res. And so, and this certainly, like, we kind of frame this out within a Navajo specific context because, that's what we can speak to. But also, I think that's kind of like Teresa was saying, like, applicable or kind of generalizable to a degree for other rural communities as well as other tribal or indigenous communities as well.
Thanks. I think I saw Adriana's hand up.
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much for sharing your work, Teresa and Marc. It's really a privilege to be listening to you in conversation with you. And what I want to ask is about the framework of relational care. and to think a little bit more about solidarity networks. And you know, we have seen a big surge also in like mutual aid networks and things like that. And so I'm wondering how this concept of relational care is related to networks of solidarity, perhaps between different colonized people, or different ways of thinking about, I guess I'm thinking a little bit about Moulton and Harney's notion of the undercommons. And so, you know, from my perspective, being, I'm from Puerto Rico, so I can, there's some similarities in terms of the context in which people are trying to deal with the pandemic. And in our context, those networks of mutual aid have been really significant, not just in terms of the actual response, but also I think in the forms of the epistemological forms, the way that we think about who the we is, right? Like who the community is. So I wonder if you could say a little bit more about that. And thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to share a slide really quick right now. Let's see. Okay, can everyone see this now? So this is a slide that we like to show. This is just to give a shout out to different mutual aid organizations. I will just speak really briefly, give a shout out for Info Shop. So this notion of you know, this isn't a framework that Marc and I introduced on our own. This is actually a framework that a lot of mutual aid organizations around Diné-centered draw upon. So it's, you know, reclaiming this notion of kinship solidarity, which is actually a really, you know, anti-colonial framework. So the Info Shop located in Window Rock, you know, was formed, you know, a few years ago as a way to provide services to our unsheltered relatives. And also, you know, the Red Nation does similar work in border towns. So currently right now they have a campaign, No Dead Natives. And this was in response to a high number of deaths every winter of our unsheltered relatives. Chish for Che literally is like firewood for our elders. So all of these organizations, you know, is actually been formed partially in response to maybe the lack of these sorts of frameworks from the formal Navajo Nation government. So there's kind of like this tension sometimes that exists between the Navajo governance and you know, these community-based services, and which forms of care actually deliver services to people. Like, for instance, we don't have you know, any quote unquote homeless shelters on the Navajo Nation. You know, there is like a meth and suicide prevention services provided by the Navajo Nation. But much like in other contexts, you know, these more mutual aid collectives were born out of the need to actually address these deficiencies of delivery by the Navajo Nation government. I'm gonna stop sharing this right now. And I mean, I think you can see this breakdown actually more explicitly in these border town contexts. I'm losing my train of thought. I'm sorry. Yeah, so the like the Red Nation, for instance, when that was formed in Albuquerque, and now has different like satellite support groups across the US actually, but there's also one in Gallup. So kind of being involved in those early initiatives, and it's mostly around supporting, you know, our unsheltered relatives. Yeah, I'm sorry, I'm losing my train of thought at the moment. Do you have any other follow-up questions around that, Adriana?
No, I think, you know, what you responded to there was really interesting, just in drawing out some of those tensions, right, around like who's the we that is cared for, and who's the we that's doing the caring, right? So thinking about yeah, just appreciating everything you're saying, and you know, interesting, those kinds of infrastructures, those social infrastructures that have been built in response to crisis, right? That's just kind of, I'm thinking comparatively with Puerto Rico, which is, you know, after Hurricane Maria, likewise, there was like a, you know, very, very big growth of those kinds of mutual aid or care, you know, socialized care kind of networks. And so I was just appreciating the way in which you were talking about those tensions that come up around, you know, what the government is doing or not doing, and then who's doing that in response, and whose responsibility is it to care, and what do you do? Okay, well, maybe it is the responsibility of this organization or state office, but they're not doing it. So then, you know, we have to do something, right? So that all those tensions around governance within the colonial context, I'm just really, you know, interested in everything that you said about that.
I think
Yeah.
also,
Oh, go ahead, Mark.
oh, I was just going to say, like, maybe adding in the context too of more a national, I think even going back to kind of the thinking about invisibility, I think a lot of that just comes through a lot of that comes through, you know, just the overall number, right, of like indigenous identifying people. And so I think some of that solidarity sometimes is necessary. And we've seen that response more on a national level to, you know, environmental concerns like extraction of resources and oil and land theft and bears ears. And so it's been interesting from what I understand, and maybe Teresa can speak to this a little bit too, but thinking about those larger acts of solidarity with, you know, indigenous identifying people and allies and non-indigenous identifying people, and even among indigenous identifying people, kind of that effort to respond to a crisis in thinking about these generational effects of, you know, consulting elders during this process while younger people are responding, and how do we come together as different tribes in responding to, you know, what are those similarities, and thinking about what that solidarity looks like is also we've seen unfold in the last few years too. And so yeah, I guess, and I think it also speaks to this visibility issue, and thinking about, you know, raising the visibility, elevating that in terms of how we think about health, how we think about how we are relational to the land itself, thinking about traditional medicines, or thinking about, yeah, just these responses to environmental issues that I think that visibility is important just moving forward, where we have been these stewards for generations, you know, and thinking about how we relate to the land, and how all these things are integrated in these processes of language use, of you know, non-patriarchal kind of systems, et cetera, and in that relational care too, and all that framework and how that's built out.
Yeah, I remembered the point I was going to say when you're talking about language use, Mark. So, I mean, even just the language of, you know, unsheltered relatives versus, say, homeless, and this isn't exclusive to, you know, mutual aid organizations on Diné-centered, but you know, using more humane language that's not so hierarchical. So it does provide this framework of relationality. And if we were thinking always in terms of our relatives, I mean, because this is already part of our kinship-based system, you know, as Marc introduced himself with his 4 clans, you know, customarily, we always begin with our clan introductions. And this isn't just like a blood relationality, right? But this is about a clan relationality. So you're always seeking out relationality and relatives wherever you go. And if you are approaching someone as a kin relative, then there is an obligation of care, of reciprocity. And it's just so vastly different from, I think, you know, non-indigenous interventions, because if you start with that framework of care and relation, that already sets up a different sort of framework of even thinking about it, something like public health or mutual aid. So that's what we're trying to encompass with this notion of. And
I'll also just add that's also non-patriarchal in that we, you know, identify ourselves through our maternal lines first, and then with our fathers, the paternal clans, we say, I guess it's translated, right, Teresa, something like born for, or like, this is the father's clan is kind of like of service to the maternal lines. And so even in introductions, it's maternalistic in that sense.
I love that. I just want to say one last thing, which is to the question of visibility. And I straddle this line between anthropology and public health or epidemiology as well in my work. And, I think like there's different kinds of visibilization, right? So you can visibilize the like endless litany of oppression and terrible things that are going on, but visibilizing these epistemological richness, right, seems to me like really valuable, which is part of what you're doing, right? It's not just visibilizing the horror, which is also necessary, but that can easily become just another kind of colonial show. So visibilizing the power of this alternative way of living and being in relation seems to me to be a better project. So congratulations.
Thank you. Yeah. Oh, seeing there's a chat here. Eben, did you want to go first?
Well, I think there probably isn't enough time to do both these questions. I've got to bounce soon, but I was just trying to think about, how these relational ethics of care might work in bad relations that are often unescapable. So with that picture of the pregnant woman and just all of those haunting isotopes that aren't going to be escapable in this lifetime or in future lifetimes. Maybe like the work that you're doing, Marc, in cancer epidemiology is sort of a relationalist, practice of ongoing care. But it was just trying to think about other bad relations that we're entangled with that are unescapable, but that we still need to care for.
I'll just say really briefly, within Navajo epistemology and ontology, like in ceremonial cycles, it's about either the maintenance of hojo, which could be crudely interpreted as like harmony or balance. So there's a whole cycle of ceremonies about the maintenance of that, and then inversely, if you are out of harmony, then there's a cycle of ceremonies that it's about protection, right? And then the restoration of that balance. So it's from a more traditional perspective, that's how health is also oriented. And of course, it's the health of mind and body and its relation to land. And all of this is a more like holistic framework. And going too far down this like nomenclature of bad, that also has significant implications. When I mentioned, if you think about death, you're not supposed to think about death because that can have ill effects on your mental, ergo physical health. Yeah. So this has become an impediment, right, to public health, because if you think about these things and you discuss these things, this is why elders or folks who, right, uranium miners and folks who were like suffering from these impacts may have not wanted to even discuss that. So that's maybe the actual impediment to addressing these health impacts. Go ahead, Marc.
Yeah, I was just going to add, from what I understand, and I'm definitely no expert on this, but from what I understand about old times, Diné self-governance really was divided into this overall idea of balance, I guess. So it was these two philosophies. One, that Teresa had mentioned in terms of thinking about kind of the beauty way and this protection way, and I think that kind of has affected the leadership of that self-governance and not hierarchical, but like in this relational way, I think, of how we think about, like quote unquote good or bad, and how we deal with what that looks like. And I think modern day and self-governance really looks like, I think it's complicated, but, and, I know we're short on time, but it really has to do with finding that balance in how we think about these kind of bad things, whether it's health or behavior or mental health or just well-being, and seeking restoration, I guess, is kind of a translation maybe of part of the goal of what that balance can look like through community, through kinship, through our prayers or songs or ceremonies. And I think that's kind of always the underlying goal, to be balanced with nature, with our mental and physical, emotional and spiritual kind of belief in ourselves and within our family and our extended family, and just more broadly to the community.
Thanks so much. See you all soon.
Yeah. Bye.
All right. Well, thanks everybody. I know we've reached our 6 p.m. point, but I want to thank our visitors today, Teresa and Marc, for joining us and for sharing this excellent new piece. It was such a thoughtful piece, such an important publication, and collaboration. I'm very looking forward to reading more of your collaborative work as you move forward together. I was going to mention that we are going to take a bit of a pause through January. Our next visitor for Coronavirus Multi-Species Reading Group is actually going to be Victor Secco, who's a microbe specialist. He's going to be talking about I think symbioses and entanglements with microbes in the Ganges River, and thinking with microbes, and that will be January 10. So we're looking forward to staying in touch with everybody, but also give everyone a little bit of time to wrap up the quarters or semesters, if that's what you're doing, and maybe just have a little bit of time together with your extended networks. And we'll see everyone in January, in the new year. So thank you so much to our speakers again, and thanks everybody. It's so lovely to see you, and I hope you are well and safe, and we'll look forward to seeing you in the new year.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Rachel.
Thank you, Teresa. Thank you,
Marc. Take care.
Thank you so much. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.